Hello, I'm Tad Dallas. I'm an assistant professor at University of South Carolina. I was invited to give a talk thinking about the future of macroecology, which is a large ask for someone who has never written a review and has only attended one of these meetings previously before now. So take what I say with this context and feel free to reach out to me through email or Twitter or at the meeting and tell me how I'm wrong or what I missed. So I'd like to start by drawing a comparison that one has probably been made before and two that some folks might not necessarily like or agree with. So community ecology has a past that seems to have periods of intense study of particular processes or systems. And that has sort of led to the rise of the so-called sort of importance of context dependency in a system, which in the late 90s led one slight curmudgeon, maybe, I don't know, to say, you know what, maybe it's time to step away from community ecology. What can we gain if nothing is generalizable and everything just seems to focus on the community of study, that ecological context specifically? And it's a call that, so community ecology is a discipline that sort of definitely precedes macroecology. And sometimes I find myself wondering if macroecology is sort of susceptible to falling into some of the same traps of community ecology. But you may be thinking, surely the scale at which macroecology is performed at gets around any of this context dependency. So in McGill's 2019 paper, he argued that macroecology is done on at least one of these scales, and it has to be large, right? It's either a large temporal scale, it's a large spatial scale, or it's a large taxonomic scale. So surely this gets around the issue of context dependency when you were using data on sort of larger ones of these scales and hopefully multiple sort of axes on this phase space. But I would argue that actually, like, it's not necessarily true, right? And so McGill does that, like, he creates this transmutation problem. Basically, we're trying to find out the relationship between annual precipitation and annual productivity. Each one of these dashed lines represents a single study. He argues that generalizability and macroecological rules come from the combination of these different studies, these different individual lines to reach some sort of emergent property of the system. But we need to recognize also that each one of these dashed lines is fundamentally biased through selection, publication biases, researcher biases, and things like that. And so if you were to remove this upper dashed line, what would necessarily happen to the relationship is maybe it would actually start to approach some like quasi-linear relationship. And so we need to sort of like just acknowledge at least that point when we think about macroecology falling into some of the same traps of bias and context dependency. And this isn't to judge how folks approach macroecological patterns. I think to progress as a field, we need examinations of existing conceptual theory just as much as we need new conceptual theory and mathematical modeling approaches which explore regions of support, which really explore not just those dashed lines, but that entire potential space of those two axes. And at its core, macroecology is based on observations of the natural world and these generalizable scaling relationships. And many of the things that I've already talked about today and that I will talk about in the next few minutes have been recognized 10 years ago by many of the people that are in this room, right? So this is nothing new, but also like we're still struggling with some of these things, even though we've made loads of progress in other areas. But in a search for these generalizable patterns that we call rules and laws, I worry that we may be a little bit cavalier about it, right? Of what we're calling law and rule. Is a law something that carries across like one or more of those temporal, spatial, or taxonomic axes in the previous plot? Or should there be some other criteria, right? Should there be an amount of variation explained cut off, or an idea of how related the variables are? And so here, this is the relationship between abundance and suitability plotted as the R² value, where we see this is a generalizable phenomenon. We generally see that species abundance is related to suitability at a given site, but it's not very predictive. It doesn't explain much variation. And those are two separate things. And so one area that I'd sort of like to be excited to see further development on is the use of mathematical models and simulation-based approaches to explore macroecological relationships. But I caution, a model designed to show a specific pattern is not a true test of theory, and we have to be careful to not fall into that pitfall or that trap. So if I condition species occupancy on species abundance, it follows that I would observe a relationship between species abundance and occupancy. This is not support for abundance occupancy relationships, as I, the modeler, have already confounded the variables from the start, right? So the development of mathematical models to explore the conditions in which macroecological relationships hold, and when they don't, is important as we move forward. But theory in the absence of data, while fun and super important, has clear limits. And so one thing that I'm also excited about is the rise of experimental tests of macroecological theory. And others have done a great job at taking ideas based on large-scale observations of natural systems and condensing them into laboratory systems, providing demonstrations of macroecological theory. And these experimental tests would allow for multiple axes of that 3D phase space to be tested at once, potentially, as well as to provide ideas of how much variance can be explained under controlled lab conditions. A related point gets at the title of this talk more explicitly, and that is the role of prediction in macroecology. We are willing to call something a law, but studies which hold out some set of data and explore the predictive ability of a macroecological model seem rare. Predictive modeling is incredibly important to the testing of macroecological hypotheses, especially as others in this session and in this meeting note that macroecological ideas could be used to inform conservation and management decisions. And prediction in macroecology has another clear benefit, right? We are not living in a static environment. Populations are not in equilibrium. And if they are, this equilibrium is almost inherently shifting. So exploring and predicting how macroecological relationships change as a function of intrinsic forces of populations, such as demographic stochasticity, intraspecific trait variation, as well as extrinsic forces, such as shifting climatic conditions and land use change, is of paramount importance. So I started this talk with the cynical idea that macroecology might run the risk of hitting some of the same issues that community ecology has dealt with and continues to deal with. Then, I hope, showed that we as a community have largely identified these issues, many nearly 10 years ago when this specific group was being formed. So looking forward, I argue that we should push ourselves to develop more formal mathematical theory and clear experimental tests of existing macroecological hypotheses with a focus on prediction. And so ideally, as we sort of do the science that we do, these relationships that we find, these things that we want to call rules and laws, will be linked with an appropriately constructed model, can be demonstrated through experimental tests, if at all possible, incorporate time and environmental change, and finally, either maybe both of these, explain loads of variation and or be predictive. All this being said, I'm incredibly optimistic for what the future holds for us all. I welcome any questions, comments, paper links that I need to read. And I'd like to close by just saying, thank you for listening to this talk. And I think it's a really exciting and great time to be a macroecologist. Thank you. That's me. Bye.